Welcome to DigiSection, a podcast about building great digital health companies and the strategies behind them. My name is Oscar. I'm a physician, inventor, and entrepreneur, and I'll be your host. The following is a conversation with Guillaume de Zwirek, the founder and CEO of Well, a company that built a digital solution helping healthcare providers to unify the full life cycle of patient interactions. The product helped to reach over 31 million patients. Guillaume is an amazing CEO and shared a lot of interesting stories. I hope you'll learn as much as I did. Hi, Guillaume, and welcome to the very first episode of DigiSection. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Oscar. Great to be here.
I think there's no better way to start analyzing changes in modern healthcare than talking about upgrading the standards of patient interactions and communication. Could you tell our listeners more about Well and the core of your solution?
So, Well does last mile patient communications for healthcare. We're trying to upend this status quo where healthcare is one of the worst industries when it comes to customer service. They're very, very good at many, many other things. But unfortunately, they haven't quite nailed customer service yet the way we have experiences in other industries, whether it's hospitality or retail or something of that nature. So, our goal is really to look at the end-to-end patient journey, unify all the communications going to patients, and to make it really, really easy to interact with your healthcare providers for everything from finding a doctor to the day of appointment to ongoing care maintenance well after you leave the doctor's office. So one phone number in your phone book that you can call or text, get an answer in a reasonable time period. That's the dream.
Okay. And what would you say is the unique tech feature making Well better than competitors?
So if we do our job right, people think that what we do is very simple. It's, the Whitman quote, if I had more time, I'd have written fewer words. To deliver great, effective communication, you're actually delivering less and you're doing it thoughtfully. And, we have, from the beginning of the company, we decided to focus just on healthcare. So we're a vertically focused company. And we've also chosen to focus just on the problem of communication. There are the healthcare experience is one of the most nuanced and complicated and highly vulnerable experiences that patient can go through. When you think about eligibility and authorization and billing and the actual appointment and referrals and labs and ongoing maintenance and medication, I could go on, right? It's complicated. So we've focused just to solve for that last mile communication, sending the communication to the patient, interpreting the response, and either responding automatically or routing it to a live human being. So we've been focused on the vertical of healthcare. We've been focused just on communication. And we've also chosen to serve the enterprise segment. And it's not because the enterprise segment is any better than single proprietor businesses, but they have very different needs. And we wanted our team to be focused on a market, on a specific solution, and on specific users and how it would be most effective to solve that problem for them. And now we've been at it for almost 6 years. We've been fortunate to get a lot of traction and to be able to drive a lot of great value for the healthcare industry. And I think in large part, it's all been because of that focus.
Great. And I also know that you were a deep believer in RCS, the Rich Communication Services. For those listeners that haven't heard about this term before, it's a communication protocol between mobile telephone carriers and between phone and carrier, aiming at replacing SMS messages. Could you tell us more about the potential of RCS in healthcare?
So I'm going to get to RCS, but I want to start with SMS, which is you have to start there to get to rich communications. The reason we initially architected the platform around SMS is because we wanted a frictionless experience. The healthcare experience is very different than, say, hailing an Uber or ordering on Amazon. The average American only goes to the physician a few times a year. The average American purchases an item
Mhm.
on Amazon many, many more times. So, for us, when we were looking at the different mediums for facilitating better relationships between patients and providers, it didn't make any sense to invest in an app because we wanted to solve for the majority of patients and their relationship with their providers. When you look at those 3 interactions a year, you're not ever going to create a bottom 4 app on the screen that the patient's going to use every single day. So SMS was the natural entry point. But SMS has some limitations. Your segments can be limited to 160 characters unless you're smart and do some splicing and follow all the carrier rules. And then when you want the patient to complete any sort of action that isn't 160 characters, you have to link them out to a web page. And you get a huge drop off when patients tap on that link because it creates friction. And you also are not able to reach some of the population who might not have smartphones, who might not have a Wi Fi or 3G or 5G these days connection. So it has some limitations. What Rich Communication Services does is it says, hey, we're going to build a new protocol that goes beyond 160 characters and lets you render rich user experiences in messaging. So if you've ever used Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or WeChat, these technologies that are so big in APAC and EMEA, um, those text messaging experiences feel very different. I mean, Oscar, I could pull out my phone right now, find you on WhatsApp, and I could pay you $20,
Yeah.
and I'd press a button and you'd press accept and you'd get it. Now imagine that for healthcare. Imagine that you get a text, a simple text: Oscar, your appointment's tomorrow. Can you show up? Well, you live in Texas and you just had a massive snowstorm and you can't get to the appointment. Your water is off, a pipe burst. You're like, no way. I can't make it. You text back, I can't make it. Imagine if the response was, would you like to do a video visit instead? And instead of a link linking you out to an app that you have to download, what if that video launched natively in your messaging window? The promise to me is that if you lose a bunch of people tapping on the link, if I can render that video in messaging, I can deliver better care to you quicker. Now, well, as a company, I have no interest, not because it's not a good problem. I don't have interest in being a video company or a paperwork company or a billing company. Those are really hard problems that also deserve focus. I want to build that last mile that integrates with those leading platforms so that you, Oscar, have a completely frictionless experience from the moment you choose a healthcare system to the day you're taking your final breath. That you had just had a very seamless experience and a great relationship with your care provider.
And would you say that RCS is having the potential to outcompete like most of the healthcare apps, and basically, downloading an app from either Google Play Store or App Store, and rather just texting?
So apps aren't going away. I do hope that RCS can, over time, replace SMS the way that we see it have the majority of market share, again, overseas. Apps aren't going away. Health systems, and I tell this to health systems too, they always have to invest in apps because everybody has chronics. I'll
Mhm.
give you an example outside of healthcare that may make this more meaningful to everybody. Um, the average American flies a couple times a year. So airlines, from a usage perspective, are very similar to healthcare. I know that's a very weird comparison, but United Airlines is more like a hospital than Amazon is like a hospital because the usage of those two services are roughly similar, about 3 times per year. United Airlines does a ton of text messaging, but they also have an app. Now, I am not an average American when it comes to flying. Pre COVID, I flew 100 legs in 2019. So 100 individual segments. I am the chronic patient in healthcare when it comes to airlines. I'm on that app every single day. The United app, I should check on my phone, is still on the front page, and I haven't flown in a year. I'm checking my loyalty every day. I'm checking my points towards status. I'm rebooking and rescheduling on the app. But if I flew 3 times a year, that thing would have been auto archived on my iPhone a long, long time ago. So apps aren't going away. Apps make sense for chronics and for specialty patients. Things like a first time mother who's going through pregnancy. Geez, she's going to be worried about her health every single day. She should have an app. In fact, when my wife was going through pregnancy, we downloaded an app and we were on it every single day and we read all the. So apps aren't going to die. But when it comes to the average person in healthcare, enabling that better relationship really needs to eliminate all friction because it's not worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze. To download an app and learn a new system and keep it maintained when you go to the doctor 3 times a year, it's not going to happen.
You're right. There are no barriers. And so, how to make healthcare the leading industry in customer experience? What would be your advice for hospital executives and engineers, and maybe new company founders?
Oh, you're coming at me strong, Oscar. I should have expected nothing less on your first podcast. Um, Look, I came into this industry because I had no healthcare background, and I just truly wanted my experience and the experience of my friends and family to be more seamless. I was going through some hard healthcare times on my own, and I was really burdened by the stress of managing that. And it seemed backwards to me. It didn't make any sense. The stress
Mhm.
wasn't because the people weren't nice and the facilities weren't nice. The stress was because I was looking at my phone every day and trying to see if I had a missed call and calling people back and getting mail I didn't understand and I could never talk to anybody. I had no point of contact. Like that was the stress. That's what created the stress. It had nothing to do with the people. It was that healthcare is complicated. In many cases, healthcare is on the bleeding edge of technology. As a result, they've acquired a lot of technology, and a lot of that technology needs to connect with me, the patient. So I've got a bunch of people reaching out to me, and it's too much for one person to manage. Um, so my advice to healthcare leaders, let's start with the hospital, physician practice side first, is that you really need to own your relationship with your customers, and that means putting a stake in the ground when it comes to communication and saying this is our protocol, this is our platform, whether you build it or buy it or wait and see to see how the market turns. Eventually you're going to have to decide on a single platform for patient communication. That is the only way to deliver frictionless, streamlined communications. And I believe that they should request that their vendors integrate into that platform the same way they request their vendors integrate into Epic or Cerner or Meditech or one of those EHRs. So fundamentally, that's a belief I have around how we flip this. We need healthcare to adopt standards, force all vendors onto that standard. Then healthcare owns all the workflows. Healthcare owns all the triage rules. And healthcare can be that single point of contact to the patient, even though it's far more complicated behind the scenes. For entrepreneurs, I would say two things. One, if you care about communication, give me a call and come work for me because this cannot be done, with one 200 people. It's going to take a village to solve this problem at scale. And two would be that there are so many opportunities ripe for innovation in healthcare, and that a lot of that last mile piece of communication I would recommend that folks either build a platform to solve that communication issue or solve other challenges and plug into those systems, which makes everybody more efficient, right? It's focus. So come work for me or use my technology. How is that for a super direct and salesy
There will
answer?
be so many people, reaching out to you. There's so many
Hey,
different
I hope so. That
channels.
would be great for your podcast and great for me.
That's
So
right. It's going to make everyone happy. And so, right now, by the way, Well is a hugely successful company with a very high growth. But could you tell us more about the early days of Well? It's always so interesting for me to learn about the first sales. I know as an entrepreneur myself that it's probably one of the hardest job for early founders to close the first, second, third customer. Could you tell us how you did that, and if you of course can disclose that, what
yeah.
were the strategies behind it?
Well, so first of all, thank you for the compliment. There is a good story here. there's a lot of debate around what the first sale was, and maybe you can tell me after I tell you the story what you would consider the first sale. So I basically locked myself in a bunker for 4 months, ideating on how well would come to life and how we would solve this problem. And once we had figured that out, I hired a development group. So I did not hire engineers, I hired a development group and I interviewed a lot of them. Um, and I paid them my life savings to build me a prototype in 1 week. No joke.
Wow.
We started like Friday night at 8 p.m. I gave them my life savings, and the next Friday at 8 p.m., I expected a functional prototype I could sell in the market. Now, it was not EHR integrated yet, but it allowed you to upload a roster of patients, automate some interactions, and communicate with them at scale. So we had this initial prototype done. My co-founder and I were leading that work, and we had decided that we were going to pick the allied healthcare market as our initial target. Allied healthcare is dietitians, nutritionists, folks of that nature that deal with ongoing care. So we needed to figure out how to reach those people. And there happened to be an exposition happening a couple weeks later in, I forget where, maybe Tennessee. It was called the Food and Nutrition Conference. And, we had no money. Like I could barely afford a flight because I had spent my life savings and I didn't have huge credit card limits. And so I flew to St. Louis where my founder lived. We rented a U-Haul. We got one of his friends to build us a booth. And we drove out like 3 or 4 hours to this conference. We might have slept in the car or a very cheap motel. I think it was a cheap motel. And we were on this it was very intimidating because we were on this massive expo floor with hundreds of companies. And by the way, like all we have is a wood booth and a computer on our thing, saying like text your patients. Everybody else is like giving away free food and samples. Like we are the odd ducks. And that weekend, we signed up 200 providers onto our software. Now, we were giving it away for free. And I have no idea who the first of those 200 people was that signed up. But one argument would be that that was our first sale at that food and nutrition conference, those 200 free users, about 200. So then we went back home, and for a couple weeks, we watched the usage and tweaked the software. And then we made a sale to one of my co-founder's friends. So his friend was a consultant who knew somebody that was doing texting. So we were telling everybody in the world, we're building texting for healthcare, right? So everybody knew this. So when they heard that somebody was looking for texting in healthcare, they'd call us. So he introduced us to this client of his who told us they were looking for physician texting. And Oscar, you're a physician, right? So doctors
Yeah.
talking to doctors, you're familiar with the software. But that's not what we did. So we convinced them that that was a really good problem, but we were not interested in solving it. We had a physician to patient texting tool that could solve different problems for them, and they bit. They said that sounds like a great solution. They believed in the vision of delivering better experience to their patients, and they bought our software and they paid us. And then we did the EHR integration. We made a lot of enhancements. It took us a few months before we took them live. So
Okay.
that was arguably second option for customer number one. And then the third option, we went through the Cedars-Sinai accelerator, and I had the opportunity to pitch their CIO. He rejected me, but eventually I convinced some of his underlings that we were the right software, and he came around and they became a customer. So those are the first three big sales. The way we actually cracked this code, though, was I read a book called Predictable Revenue, and I hired a sales development rep who sat right next to me. And for weeks, I would listen to him make calls and we would tweak it. And eventually we got a demo. And eventually that demo turned into a sale. And eventually that sale turned into ROI. And to this day, I'm in an empty office right now, but the sales development team sits right outside my desk. There's just a sea of desks in front of me. So long story. So now the question for you is, which is the first sale? Is it the nutrition? Is it the friend of a consultant who we convinced that they needed a different piece of software? Is it Cedars-Sinai, or is it the first sale from a cold call?
Oh, I think I would actually know. Count the literally first one that you said that with the nutritionists.
Yeah.
I'm impressed how well organized, focused, and persistent you stayed through that time between like the first touch point with the very first customer and then selling to Cedars. Have you already raised rounds at that point?
We were bootstrapped. We were bootstrapped throughout the nutrition period. We were bootstrapped with our first client. Um, that well, now I'm calling the second one the first one, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
The friend of the
Hmm.
consultant, I guess the second client. And then with Cedars, we were able to take a convertible note with the accelerator. So I guess that would be called pre-seed. It wasn't a ton of money. It was $100,000. It wasn't that much money, but it was technically an investment. And then we raised our seed round after that. So we probably had about 20 customers when we raised our seed round. And I will tell you though, I had spent my life savings in 1 week, and that's not an exaggeration. I had nothing left. And what I did, I call burning the ships. There's a whole story about that your listeners can Google. But what I did is I sent an email to all of my friends and family who had gone into banking or consulting when I was in college. I thought they probably have some savings, right? Those are the fields where you make a lot of money. So I emailed them all and said, hey, I'm starting a company. Here's what we do. We're going to sell to nutritionists. We're going to sell patient communication software, and we're going to make the world a better place. I said, you can all put in, I accept one check size, $20,000. That's it. No hard feelings if you're not in, but just tell me if you're in or out. Here's the terms. Here's the valuation. Let me know. And I had 10 people respond and say, I'm in. Now, I had to take some calls and convince some of them a little bit. And it was shocking to me how some of them were just blindly like, yep, here you go. And I was like, is that your life savings? Because so then I say burn the ships because I was out of money. My closest friends gave me money. So all of a sudden I had this, and I didn't consider that money to be an investment. I consider that to be debt. Even though legally it was an investment, I never would have had to pay them back. I told myself that if this company didn't work, I would pay every single one of them back. So I considered myself $200,000 in debt after I took that friends and
Hmm.
family money.
You're a very good fundraiser.
I'm not a very good fundraiser. I've become better. I have a lot of horror stories from fundraising.
Oh,
So,
and by the way, how to make fundraising less stressful? I think there's so many founders right now, listening to this and raising their seed rounds or A rounds. Uh, we all know that it's, basically, I mean, the foundations are, as always, human relationships, but are there any tips and tricks or things that, people could apply and
yes.
just get more comfortable with this process?
One, be organized. Build a spreadsheet. And I have samples. Your
Hmm.
listeners, after they either request a job or whatever I said earlier, I'll give them the spreadsheet. I'm just kidding. I'll give the spreadsheet for free. Be organized. It took me all the way until Series B to build the spreadsheet the right way, and I finally nailed it, and that really helped me manage the process better. So one is be organized. Two is start early. Start building these relationships early. There are folks that I would have raised from recently that I met 5 years ago. So those
Yeah.
relationships are important to cultivate. So start early and stay cordial with those folks. Reach out to them once a year. Hopefully they reach out to you. That's two. Three is don't waste your time. If you meet with an investor and they don't feel bought in, they're never going to come around. They're option seeking. I put any investor who I talked to who wasn't forthcoming with me, I put on my DNC list, do not contact ever again.
Hmm.
Because for me, I wanted to raise money from people who would be straight with me, even if it was what I didn't want to hear. So I always respected investors who told me why they weren't going to invest, and I kept them on my list because those are the types of people I wanted to do business with later. But if investors are passive, they don't seem very interested, come back to me when you have more traction. That's garbage. They're not interested. They're option seeking. Um, and I wasted so much time chasing those people and doing so many meetings that I didn't have to. So for me, those are the three things: be super organized, run a tight process. I have a spreadsheet template I can share.
Hmm.
To um, start early, and three is don't waste your time.
Okay. Okay. And if we can just get back for a couple of minutes to interfaces, and what's next in the space of communication. So you said once that the patient communication should be unified, meaning all messages coming to one place, accessible, so via preferred communication channels, and human. And I love to talk about the third point because in one of your earlier interviews, you said that medical bots shouldn't exist if they don't pass the Turing test. So I wanted to ask if there's any way you would create a medical Turing test, and how would you create such an experiment?
There's probably a way to do this with our technology at scale. It's a good idea. You have my brain thinking, Oscar. Um, the litmus test I use, and the Turing test is a bit of a hyperbole. The litmus test I use is, if I got this message, would I respond? Stop, all caps. It's kind of like when you pick up the phone and you just start screaming, agent, 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 or you press zero. Nobody wants to go down the bot rabbit hole. And one of the concerns I have just with how much airtime chatbots get in healthcare is that we're almost leapfrogging a very important part of the solution, which is we're doing a lot of things over the phone today and over snail mail. Sure, it's not efficient. Sure, it's expensive. Sure, patients don't like it. But if you skip over that and automate everything over text, you think patients are going to like that? Of course not.
Mhm.
Like I was talking about earlier, how nuanced and vulnerable and fragile healthcare is. Like, do you think people want to talk to a bot? First of all, our bots are so far away from passing the Turing test. They have to be so deliberate, right? So if you say, Oscar, if you say, hey, I want to cancel my appointment, well, look, I can auto respond and say, you've been canceled. Like, well, it's a bot? Probably. Like, no human would respond to you within like 3 milliseconds. But like, do you care? No, you only care if your next response is, I changed my mind. And it's like, sorry, I don't understand your request. Like, that's when you care. So I believe, and from the beginning of Well, I believe that you need to build a system where your fail safe is a human. And that human, you need to have the right alerting and UI tools in place to enable that human to respond in a
Mhm.
reasonable period of time. So now the question becomes what is reasonable? I don't think, is it 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week? I would argue that what is reasonable depends on the channel. On live chat on a website, what's reasonable is probably 30 seconds.
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but if I'm type a question on a website and in 30 seconds I don't get a response, X out. On text message, an hour,
Oh, okay.
you send a
Mhm.
text. If you get a response in an hour, you're probably satisfied. A day, just think about you and your friends. You're like, geez, they haven't responded to me yet. I'm getting a little frustrated. Email, a day is probably appropriate. So it's by channel. I'm totally moving away from your question. The answer is we could probably do this at scale with Well, and we could analyze how often patients respond stop to a message. And we would know, I think, pretty definitively what types of workflows are being automated today that aren't being appreciated by patients. And those to me wouldn't pass the Turing test. So I like it. I think we're going to do it. Great idea.
And when do you see voice AI becoming a sort of standard for communication, also in healthcare? Is it going to be, 5, 10, or 20 years from now?
I'm so excited about the promise of voice. I was talking to my wife about this recently, and I was just curious. I used to work at Google, and I was just curious what she thought the most popular
Mhm.
queries for the voice assistants are today. And my guess was that 90% of the usage is for three things: weather, what time is it, and play this song. Because that's all I use my Google Assistant for. Um, I think the world is still figuring out how to weave voice into other workflows, right? Right now, I'd feel a little uncomfortable if my Google Home was like, your appointment is coming in an hour, traffic is
Mhm.
26 minutes. I would feel a little uncomfortable. So I think part of it is probably just consumer readiness, and that could accelerate quickly. I think consumers could get there Probably not a year from now, but probably in the next couple of years. But then the workflows, when does it make sense to talk to somebody over one of these voice devices? That I don't think we've solved yet. We've only just solved it for live chat, right? That's really marketing use cases on a
Mhm.
website. Like that's what live chat is for. But I don't think we've solved that for voice yet. So I think we're a few years away. I hope it's quicker because I think it holds so much promise. And frankly, well, as it does become more mainstream, we'll need to consider voice as part of our communication set. But I still think we're a few years away.
I'd love now to talk a bit about the consumerization of healthcare. So, we observed many digital providers getting stronger and huge deals being made, say, mergers such as Teladoc Livongo and IPOs like GoodRx, One Medical, Clover Health, or most recently HIMSS. What is your take on this trend, and how do you see that shaping the access to healthcare?
Well, I'm a subscriber to several of those companies, and I think it comes back to a similar theme, which is convenience. Creating frictionless user experiences, and taking the work out of being a consumer of healthcare. So I love the trend. I love that. We for a long, long time we had the public markets were void of consumer centric healthcare companies. There were none. You hadn't seen healthcare IT. When I started this company, healthcare IT was not a sexy space. Investors had not seen a ton of success from healthcare IT, and I think it's a very different scenario right now. So I love it, on a personal level. As a consumer, I love it as a founder of a company in this broader space. Um, I do think it's helping accelerate a lot of change in what many would consider more legacy and traditional healthcare providers. I think a prime example of this that hits close to home for me is Cerner. Cerner has chosen to really invest in their partnership strategy. We are partners of theirs now, which is why I bring it up as an example where
Mhm.
I think they're understanding that to meet the needs of consumers and the timelines that consumers expect, they're not going to be able to do it on their own. Cerner is a massive cruise ship. They're not a speedboat. So they want to work with, they want to bring some speedboat captains next to the ship so
Sure.
that they can deliver value to their constituents. So I think it's a fantastic thing for the industry. It's you know, for how really debilitating and sad COVID has been. Um, if that I guess the glass half full thinking or the bright side is that everyone I think would agree that it has accelerated the way healthcare organizations think about technology. What's the saying? Never waste a crisis. I think that's a prime example of what we've gone through over the last year.
Yeah, you're right. And by the way, do you have any contrarian viewpoints when it comes to our part of the industry and what's happening right now?
Oh, uh, I have plenty. I I think um, the biggest one for me is that you'll like this as a physician. When it comes to healthcare, I really believe in the old school model back to the 1800s where a physician comes to your house on a horse and buggy, and you have boogie or buggy, I don't know how that word is said, but where you have a relationship with your physician. And maybe I'm weird. Maybe I'm one of very few people like that, but I tend to believe that most people, when it comes to their healthcare, really care about who they interact with. Um, they don't want a menu of a million providers and to go with somebody random. It's much more important that they go to somebody they trust who knows their history. And so I believe in empowering physicians. I believe that physicians should own the relationship with patients. I don't think businesses like mine have any business owning the relationship. And I think that's contrarian. I think a lot of tech companies would prefer
Mhm.
to own the consumer. Because when you own the consumer, there's a lot you can do. There's a lot of money to be made. Look at Google, look at Facebook. When you own the content, when you own the channel, you can become very, very wealthy. Um, I believe the physicians should own the patient. Well doesn't have a brand to patients. If you're a physician using well, your patients don't know. Uh, Oscar is saved as a contact in my address book. I think that's how it should be.
Mhm.
And I don't think very many companies, I know for a fact, many companies don't feel the same way.
So you believe, in short, in old school medicine empowered by tech
Yeah.
and the beauty of the relationship.
The new horse and buggy is text messaging and hopefully RCS and then maybe voice in the future.
And being the founder and especially a CEO like you is a lonely sport. I'd even say an extreme sport. I heard that you used to run ultra marathons and also do Ironmans. Did this shape your persistence and resilience? Do you think that it helped you right now in your career as an entrepreneur?
It's interesting. So I've never actually done an ultra marathon, but I've done many Ironmen, I should say. It should really be called Iron Person, but anyhow, a different debate. It's interesting because a lot of folks who do the Ironman event are CEOs and they run companies. There's actually a whole division. I forget what it's called, but it's just CEOs. So I think there's just a certain grit that you have to
Mhm.
be willing to tolerate to found and scale a company. And that journey is very similar to the journey of an Ironman. My last Kona, which is the Ironman in Hawaii, I had two flat tires. I had a ton of issues in that race. And I would assume that many Ironman make successful CEOs because you can't be out there for 8, 9, 10 hours. There's got to be some sort of determination to either get to the finish line or win to put yourself through that.
I'll definitely have to try it one day. I was only doing half marathons like 5 or 6 years ago, and regularly playing tennis. But that's the most extreme sport for me.
Well, I think any sport falls into that, and I've heard that you were quite a good tennis player. So, and you are also a founder. So it we have a sample size of two, but right now we're 2 for 2.
Everyone is right now talking about the vaccinations. So far, more than 68 million doses of jabs have been given. In the last week, an average of 1.3 million doses per day were administered. I heard that also well is a huge help in the process of rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, we've been both when COVID happened, we became very involved in trying to figure out how to help with education, as well as coordination of COVID tests. And as we move from testing to vaccination, we've applied some of our similar thinking. And what's interesting is it's not just about scheduling the vaccine. There's actually it's far more complicated. There's everything from, are you eligible for the vaccine? What should you
Mhm.
expect? Education to help people decide whether they want the vaccine or not, because there's a lot of false information out there. Then, of course, to scheduling the first dose, but also the second dose, and then adverse outcome reporting to the government bodies that are tracking that information, as well as the pharmaceutical companies. So there's actually quite a big lift required for our customers to effectively distribute the vaccine. And then, we're not talking about their usual flow, right? There are these max vaccination sites that are seeing 5, 10,000
Mhm.
patients a day, right, in one site. That is an order of magnitude of scale that these organizations have never had before. And you can't do that with a 200-person call center, right? You need to find a way
Mhm.
to effectively let patients know, provide them reassurance, around the vaccine and whether whether it makes sense for them to get it, help them through that first and second dose and the monitoring period. So we've been helping on all of those quadrants. I suspect that the vast majority of our customers have workflows configured in well to handle the vaccine. There's another use case I'll mention, which is just supply. A lot of these vaccines require cold storage. So if anybody misses their appointments during the day or something happens, like in Texas, last week, horrible, right? But they had power outages and they had vaccines that they had to deploy. We had a customer who sent a mass communication to their community and just said, look, we have X many vaccines. If you can get here, we'll give it to you. because it's better that somebody gets vaccinated than the vaccine spoils. So those are 5 or 6 of the ways that people have been using well to manage communications with their customers. I still think there's a promised land I'd like us to get to. I'd like Oscar to be able to text his provider who's in his phone book because he no longer has a horse and buggy, and you like your provider and you want to have a relationship with him. And I'd like you to be able to text and say, hey, I need to travel next week. I wanted to know if you could help me coordinate a vaccine. And I would love for that text to turn into, hey, Oscar, you're not eligible yet, but sometimes we have an excess of supply. You've been added to a list. And if we have excess of supply, you'll get a text letting you know where you can show up and by what time. Like, that'd be a cool workflow. We're not quite there yet. And my guess is that COVID will be pretty well handled before we get there as a technology platform.
And how long does it take to implement the Will platform?
Yeah, so we have deployed a version of our software. We brought a version of our software to market that can be deployed in as little as 5 days. In as little is a big caveat there because there are some things that could extend that timeline. And the way we implement is a little bit different than we normally would. Our normal implementation, is 30 to 90 days.
Okay.
And is much more intensive. But we took a step back to figure out how we could get our software operational, solving the problem as quickly as possible, because a lot of these organizations, nobody has 90 days to wait. They need a solution yesterday. So we've gotten our solution live in as little as 5 days, and it's been really rewarding to see the impact it's had on the community.
Yeah, that's a great work, and also very impactful for everyone during these hard times. As my final question, I'd love to reiterate on the question about how should we guide young people listening to this podcast right now about their future. Say, if they'd like to start a company, I mean, we for sure know that they should come to you as point number one. But say they're they're considering starting a startup company in the healthcare space. What would you encourage them to focus on, and what kind of space to research as the primary one?
I can't even directly answer your question because having gone through this journey myself, I know that the initial idea is likely to change. And all that matters is being really passionate about solving a problem and being willing to do it at all costs. And if you have that, you should start a company. And you will figure it out. And many, many people will give you advice, but most of that advice you should throw away, including everything I've said in this podcast. And you will chart your own journey based on the unique needs that you're solving for and the situation in the market at that time. And what you thought you were going to do is probably going to be a lot different than you did. I would encourage folks to enter the healthcare space because I think there's so much to be solved. It's an exciting space. It's good for society. It's good for the world. Go into it with open eyes. Go into it with a ton of passion, a ton of grit, and you will either learn a ton, which to me is a gift no one can ever take away from you, or you'll be wildly successful and you'll solve a problem. So I don't think there's any way to lose.
Guillaume, thank you for your advice, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Oscar. It was a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to DigiSection on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or just go to our website, digisection.fm. See you next time.